And so we are very delighted to be joined today by 5 of our program partners, each of whom is going to be giving a very short 5-minute presentation about one aspect of selecting a stellar cohort. So with no further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Pamela Roussos from the Miller Center of Social Entrepreneurship.
Thanks, Avery. Thank you all. So selecting a stellar cohort, if there's one thing that you remember from my discussion with you is that it's a constant learning process. Lean in and be curious. For us, what is really important is starting with the criteria and being really specific about criteria. Miller Center is based at Santa Clara University, which is a Jesuit university. So for us, it starts with our entrepreneurs need to be serving the poor. We also have several different programs, so we need to make sure that the entrepreneurs that are applying are at the right stage for the programs we're selecting for. Then we have other things that we're looking for, like scalable businesses. Can we help them? Do we feel like we can help them? And is the entrepreneur coachable? Because we don't want to waste their time or our time. So the next piece of this is sourcing these amazing entrepreneurs. So what we've found over the years is that about 1/3 of the cohort is usually sourced by references from our existing alumni. We've been around working with social entrepreneurs, over 900 social enterprises over 15 years. So there are a wealth of references for us. Then we also have discovery partners, organizations that are in this room and others that are not, like Echoing Green and Ashoka. They provide us really valuable deal sourcing. And then also, just good old-fashioned conferences, networking, and things like that. So usually about 1/3, and 1/3 is what we're seeing in our cohorts. Then comes the fun part of the application process, and that is really very much a balancing act, right? Asking enough questions that you get answers to the questions that you're looking for your selection criteria, not asking them too many so that it gets just too onerous for the entrepreneurs. But over time, we've learned some best practices, because one of the things that we're very, very serious about is that every interaction that a social enterprise has with us is a learning moment for them. And so in filling out the application, there's plenty of learning opportunities. So what we've done is, what does a good answer look like? We're asking that for their impact metrics. Well, what would a good example of that look like? We're providing them, we use a lot of buzzwords, operational expenses, break even, runways. What do those things mean? So we're teaching and training the entrepreneurs as they're filling out the application. Then being able to save the applications, because guess what? Most of the entrepreneurs that apply the first time don't get accepted. So the next time they apply, they can not have to start from scratch. Our application process looks pretty familiar. I think this would look very familiar to most of you. One thing that, again, constant learning, one thing that we did about 2 years ago is we put in the stage 1 interview, 15, 20 minutes with the program manager, that then makes sure that our stage 2 interviews are much higher value, better quality. But again, as they're going along, if we're not selecting them, in every stage we're providing them resources, places to go that they can learn more and such, so that we're providing them value every step of the way. We do have a scoring matrix. You can kind of see how we score the criteria. We use a Likert scale, 1 to 5. Your 4 is going to be different than my 4, but we always see is that there's always a group of stellar people that show up at across all of the interviewees, and then there's those that are going to fall out, and where the art rather than the science is those ones in the middle, and having the discussion around who really gets into the cohort and who doesn't. But I would say that if there's another thing that you remember from my discussion here, is that in order to select a stellar cohort, you have to be running stellar programs, because it's your alumni that are going through the program, and they're walking billboards for you. And so the question is, you have to ask yourself is, what are they saying about your program? Because again, stellar people attract stellar people. Thank you.
So up next, we have Paul Basil with Villgro.
Great, thank you. Just as a starting context, we don't do a cohort-driven program. So just to put that in context, but we see around 2,000, 3,000 applications a year. It ranges. Whenever we have a push program campaign, we see 2,000 to 3,000. So with that as a context, when I select a stellar cohort, I worry about what I call portfolio balance. So I look at my existing portfolio, and I want to make sure that I don't load any of these stages, right? So I want to make sure that if you have to achieve impact, if you have limited resources at your hand, you got to make sure that if you have many companies which are really minimum viable product ready, how do you make sure that you balance it off with a few ones out here? Which means that you still need to offer programs that can actually deliver across this continuum. So that's practice number one, which is very important for me. The reason why I talk about that is we have limited resources, got to push companies to actually creating impact. So that's practice number one. Practice number two, it's a little bit complicated slide, but building on what Pamela spoke, there is a process. But one piece that I want to highlight there is what I call a Wednesday 10 a.m. internal investment committee. And that's powerful because we group back every Wednesday. The team working on the diligence goes out, asks questions, comes back with some of those data points, and it's actually gray hair then applies gut over those data points. And you are allowed to do that because young portfolio managers who are actually going out there and asking questions normally don't have the gut and the ability to connect the dots. So the Wednesday 10 o'clock allows us to actually assess risks. And what it also does is it allows us to define what support they need. So Wednesday 10 a.m. is a great practice to actually follow if you're in the business of selecting a stellar cohort. Building again from Pamela's scoring sheet, I'm just taking it to another level where we have a rubric. And the reason why we use this rubric is because, again, younger team members, if you actually ask them what's impact and scale them from 0 to 5, as Luni mentioned, everyone has their own definitions of impact. So I've actually put here some qualities in a business model. So when you're actually defining a business model as innovative, how would you classify, right? For example, if you rate 4, it means that there is significant innovation, right? But if it's 1, there's actually no innovation. So the young portfolio manager who's doing this is not just going to arbitrarily rate them as 4 or not, but you're actually giving them certain words that allow them to actually, collect data points. And that actually betters your scoring. And the chances that you actually get select from a pool of 1,000 is actually much better. My experience and our experience over many years is that if you have a tech-based company, to really build a great stellar cohort, I actually select a lot of young entrepreneurs. Those guys are great. But if it's an execution-heavy business, where there's a lot of focus on brick and mortar businesses, I actually rely on seasoned professionals. I don't look at young people because they can't anticipate failures a lot, but they're really great in building mobile apps, contraptions, hardware, and stuff like that. But if it's an execution-oriented business, I really look at seasoned corporate professionals. And one last one that is, there's a last but one. I don't know how much time I have. But the other thing that we do is we define our sector themes and subsector themes. For instance, in health, I really want to see maternal and child healthcare, and in that specifically in neonatology, devices and diagnostics. That allows me to actually have researched on the business model beforehand. I don't research on the business model once the company comes in. My theory of change around that sub-theme is well defined. So what I'm doing in my selection is only doing an entrepreneur selection. I'm not researching on the opportunity. I'm not researching on the business model. That takes a lot of time off for me. I'm just researching on the capability and the abilities of the entrepreneur to actually realize and execute on that business model. And that applies for in agribusiness. You can do actually farm implements, market linkages, but set your sub-themes is a good practice to actually follow. I think one of the best references that we've got, adding on to that list, is downstream investors. So it could be banks, it could be venture capitalists who are actually struggling. When an entrepreneur goes to them, they clearly know what the risks are. And many times we are actually seeing references by them telling us, hey, invest in them, take the risk, incubate this aspect of the business, and then come back to us, and we might actually consider investing. And we are seeing that as a good pipeline for us, and it's actually a good conveyor belt that we're building, because if you actually incubate them, it's very likelihood that they will invest in them. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So up next, we have Luni from Fledge.
All right, I'm going to do this with no slides. How many people have a selection matrix like Pam showed? Pamela, sorry. Only a few hands? Okay. So we have one. I'm going to show you how we got there because ours is going to look a little different. So the big question is, once you've gotten through the process, once you've gotten through the interviews, how do you know which is the right companies to pick, right? You have a whole bunch of interview data, but you don't have any numbers to play with, and I like numbers. So back in the day, what I used to do is we used to go to the window in my kitchen, because it was glass and easy to work with, and we'd take all the applicants that we thought were good enough, and we would map them out in terms of two axes. So maybe this is impact and odds of success. And we would just take the Post-it notes and lay them out the way we thought they worked, and you just kind of picture that in your mind, and then I would actually do this with my wife way back in the day. And she would yell out, all right, how about competition? And then we would quickly move these around and say, all right, well, this one has a lot of competition and not, and this one doesn't, and so forth. She'd yell at the next criteria. Well, how much money do they need to raise? Oh, we've got to move them all around again. And what you see when you do this over 10 or 15 different criteria, whether it's one dimension or two, is that some of them wind up over here a lot, and some of them wind up over here a lot. These you just throw away, right? And you get down to fewer and fewer, but whenever we did this, we never got down to 7, which is the number we like to bring into the cohort. We always had 8 or 9 or 10. We didn't have the number that told us where they ranked. And so the issue with just building a spreadsheet that says, here's our criteria, and here's our rating from 1 to 5, or 1 to 10, or 1 to whatever, is that every one of those columns is then weighted equally. And so the real question is, what is the actual weights that you care about, right? So if the criteria that you decide upon are, let's say, team, impact, and odds of success, well, what's the weighting of rating a 1 on team versus a 4 on team versus a 5 on team? What's a weighting of 1 impact, 2 impact, 3 impact, and so forth? And so I was pointed to, in year 2 of Fledge, I was pointed by an applicant to this tool called 1000minds.com out of New Zealand. And what the tool does is you give it what criteria you care about. Again, so let's just use the simple example of team, impact, and odds of success. You pick how many ratings you have in each one of those, and you can name the ratings if you want. And then what the tool does is it randomly picks 2. So which would you rather have? Would you rather have the perfect team that has no, well, in this criteria, no, we'll do simpler ones. Would you rather have the perfect team that has no traction, or one level down on team, but they have $50,000 of revenue, right? Now, there's no clear answer there, and they get harder. Which would you rather have? Would you rather have the team that has a really high impact but a huge amount of competition, or a team that has a middle amount of impact and no competition? And so this tool will simply bring forth about 40 or 50 or 60, depending on your criteria, sometimes 100 of these pairings, and it may take an hour for you to go through it. But what comes out with at the end is the actual weights that you care about. It will tell you that team, 5 on team is 27% out of 100. And that 5 on impact might be 18% out of 100. And that 5 on odds of success is really only 2 out of 100. And so when I do this for real, I've gone back and done historical analysis. I've come up with the criteria. I've thrown in all the values of all the applicants when they applied the first time, and see whether or not the ones that fail fall to the bottom. And so what we have out of this is a criteria that we use to figure out which ones are going to fail, and then the ones that bubble to the top are most likely not to fail, and then we pick from those.
And now we have Ebony from Village Capital.
Awesome. There's so much to walk through. I'm going to try to get through all of this. For us, it's like a 3-month process when we're talking about selecting a cohort. Initially, it can feel like, where do you even start? How do you find the most relevant companies? For us, it's a combination of, we try to start with roundtables and market analysis. So we're bringing together industry experts in a certain industry, as well as investors to see like what are investable markets, as well as doing market analysis to see like what is a major problem that we think that we could solve that also will give us investable companies. Oh, yes. So our program lead will put together, like, what is the problem? They'll map out, here are 10 companies that we think have are strong for this pipeline that they'll present to our managing director. And if it's a go, then we'll move forward with opening applications. So about 3 weeks before we open applications, we make sure that we're casting a wide net. So, of course, we have been doing this a long time, so we have deep networks of pipeline, hundreds of companies in each of our 5 sectors. We also, of course, go to conferences, but we also really try to meet entrepreneurs where they are. So a big value proposition for us is that we're looking for companies in overlooked regions and from overlooked backgrounds. And so we're making sure that we're going to those specific conferences. We sometimes do road shows for different ecosystems and set up happy hours so that we're making sure that when people are thinking about applying to different programs in these areas that are maybe a little bit more obscure or from these different communities, that they even know about Village Capital. So next is less is more. So from our galley research, we found what we used to do is that we would try to get as many companies as possible to apply. So we would have we need to have 150 companies apply to a specific program. But what we found from the research of our different cohorts is that the programs that had less applicants actually performed better. So we've gotten a lot more targeted that you don't necessarily need 150 applications. If you have 60 to 100 very relevant applications, then that's much better, and it saves you more time. It's easier to go through. So what we do is, when we're going through our pipeline before we open applications, we do something that's called top 5s. We'll have that program manager send to myself as well as the our investment managing director of the fund, as well as a few people internally. We'll look at 5 companies each week and kind of score them on a 1 to 4 basis of like, yes, I'd like to learn more. No, it's not a fit. So by the time that we open applications, we have like 30 to 50 companies that we really want to go after. And so for them, we reach out and we call them. We have very targeted emails of trying to get them to convert. We also, of course, are sending like mass emails, but we're really focusing on those people that we really want and contacting them and making sure to market and sell, like, what is the value proposition of Village Capital versus other programs or versus just doing it yourself. Because what you'll find is sometimes like the top companies that you want, they're like, I don't necessarily want to do an accelerator, or like, I'm doing really good on my own. So you have to figure out, like, listening to them, what are the things that what are their main pain points, and how you can sell whatever your program offerings are. Lens for diversity, so we bake into the KPIs, like, if on a weekly basis, if you're bringing in like 30 companies have applied, that a portion of them need to be women or minorities or things like that. And on selection calls, we also prioritize diversity is to make sure that our cohorts are diverse as far as those aspects, as well as to make sure they're not all solving the same problem. So in education, you might want some higher education, some future work to make sure there's diversity in your cohorts. Collaboration for our programs, they're a cohort basis, and so they need to all be able to get along with each other. We screen for people that aren't really interested in going through our program. We need that commitment and for them to stay and persist. And a few people can like really make things toxic. So as you're doing interview calls with people, really seeing like who's aligned mission-wise with whatever you guys are trying to accomplish. And then last but not least is partner fit. So for each of our programs, they're sponsored by a large partner. For example, for FinTech, PayPal is our large sponsor. So in the beginning, we'll kind of ask them, like, what kind of companies are you interested in acquiring or partnering with? And we kind of then go backwards to find companies that fit that, so that our mentor interactions are very valuable on both sides. Like the president of PayPal is at our FinTech program this week, or we have product managers, so that the companies are really getting a lot of value as well as the mentors.
Thank you, Ebony. And now we have Sana from Spring.
So for us, when it comes to selecting a cohort, it's all about starting with the why. Why are we doing what we're doing? What's the bigger purpose here? And how is this going to align with that bigger objective? And that drives pretty much every decision that we make. Then we zone in on the program goals. And so if it's an investor readiness one versus an acceleration one, what are the main criteria that this program is looking to achieve? And then again, how does that tie back into the big why? And that helps us set parameters for the types of applicants that we're going to be looking to seek. Understanding that we should, again, bake in diversity from the onset, that it's going to take a nice mix of people coming from, different, whether it's more women, different minorities, etc., but having a nice mixed bag from the beginning is something that we strive for. Taking one step back in terms of how we get the message out, because that's going to affect what types of applicants you attract. So going wide, whether it's through different social platforms, other platforms that we're plugged into that talk about accelerator programs, as well as going close and through partners, referrals, etc. Once applications come in, we start to screen things, and similar to what Ebony was describing, we try to have more than one person in the team objectively view all the applications to make sure that there's not just one voice that's taking charge. Try to anonymize things as much as possible, so taking things out like name, gender, etc., and just looking at the application for that first screen for what they're about and the quality of the answers that have been provided, rather than think about where they're from or what they're about, etc. So that helps to make it quite a clean process from the beginning. We too have multiple touch points, so whether you applied online, that's the first level of screening. Then potentially a follow-up phone call, a video call, bringing someone in. In some cases, there's also asks for deeper due diligence around submitting, whether it's market-related documents, financial plans, etc. And then it comes to scoring and tiering and moving people from one round to another, and then coming up with a short list who we then try and match, basically, and make sure that it ties again with those program goals that have been identified. So that's all the sort of quantitative stuff that we do. Then it's the more qualitative. How impact aligned is this cohort? Are they contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals in the way that we look at impact? And how are they able to describe the positive change they want to have in the world? The next thing that we look for is coachability, because again, this is a cohort-based approach. People need to work well together. They need to have an open mind. They need to be open to feedback. They need to also want to share with each other. And so that's an element that we look for to make sure that the group is going to gel. As is investability, because we tend to work with post-launch growth stage businesses. And so whether they're funding ready now or they will be in 6 or 12 months, thinking ahead about how we could start to put them in front of investors is something we try to think about from the onset. And then the third element is how global are they in their mindset? So are they starting to think about their solution from a global perspective? And how exportable is what they're trying to do. And then this is an important one because it's all about collaboration for us, right? And so we want to make sure that the cohort and each member learns not only from us, but from each other, and there's a good, safe space for people to be vulnerable and share. And then it's really just a matter of getting the right fit. If you're like me and you like tea and biscuits, it should feel as pleasant. Or Tetris. Because once you're in, you're family, and you're never going to be able to shirk us off, because we'll always have your back. Thanks.